John sank heavily onto the high bar stool, the tension in the back of his neck pulsing like a hot wire. The traffic on the highway south of Los Angeles was a nightmare today, endless lines of cars, honking, drivers looking annoyed, as if the entire city had decided to get stuck on one stretch of road at once. It was Friday night, the end of the work week, and he still couldn't shake thoughts of work from his head. Deadlines, reports, and especially that anxious call from his boss, Martin, that had come like a hammer this morning. "John, we need to talk. We have questions about your report. Urgent." John didn't know what had gone wrong, but the call was stuck in his head like a splinter, giving him no peace. And the vacation he had been looking forward to so much now seemed like an elusive promise, far away and almost unattainable. He rubbed his temples, trying to drive away the fatigue, and glanced at the hallway. There, on the table, among the usual pile of bills and advertising brochures, lay a white envelope. An unusual one, made of thick paper, with gold letters embossed on the surface, "Party." No names, no addresses. John frowned, but at first he simply walked past, deciding that this was some more nonsense. He headed for the kitchen, where Emily was already bustling about. She stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose bun, swaying slightly as she moved. Emily always looked like she had just stepped out of a picture-perfect family commercial, but today there was something vaguely fidgety about her movements, as if she were trying to distract herself from some thought. John sat down at the kitchen island, feeling the weariness settle into his bones. "Long day?" Emily asked without turning around. Her voice was soft but slightly hoarse, as if she herself was tired but trying to hide it. "You have no idea," John muttered, rubbing his neck. "Traffic, Martin with his calls, a report that looks like it's going to have to be redone. How are you?" Emily turned, and a smile touched her lips. But there was something odd about the smile, too bright, too forced, as if she were trying to hide a shadow of worry behind it. "Oh, I'm doing the usual," she replied with a shrug and returned to the stove. "I decided to make your favorite stew. Thought you needed something to cheer you up." John nodded, but his gaze slid back to the hallway, to the envelope. He stood up, walked back to the table, and picked it up. His fingers felt the pleasant weight of the paper. This was definitely not a cheap advertisement. Turning the envelope over, he noticed the small print at the bottom, "Partners Exchange Club." The name pricked him, a vague sense of recognition, but he couldn't remember where he'd heard it. He returned to the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter. "What do you have in your hands?" he asked, looking at Emily. She glanced quickly at the envelope, her smile faltering for a split second before she regained her composure. "Oh, nothing special," she said, turning back to the stove. "Just an invitation to this themed thing. See, it's called the Partner Swap Club. Probably some kind of quest or show. Nothing special." Her voice was light, almost playful, but John caught the slightest hint of nervousness in it. He raised his eyebrows, trying to figure out if she was joking or not. "A partner swap club?" he asked, trying to sound more curious than wary. "Is this a partner swap club, or am I getting something wrong?" Emily laughed, but it came out a little sharper than usual. She turned to him, wiping her hands on a tea towel, her eyes twinkling mischievously, but with a hint of uncertainty. "Oh, John, don't start," she said, coming closer and giving him a light slap on the shoulder. "It's just an invitation from Kate. You know how she likes to throw unusual events. Probably some kind of fancy dress party or game. She mentioned it was Saturday night across town. We should go, don't you think?" John tapped the envelope thoughtfully. Emily's friend from college, Kate, was known for her penchant for eccentric events. One day she'd throw a Great Gatsby-themed party. The next she'd organize a nighttime escape room in an abandoned warehouse. But something about the invitation, the title, Emily's reaction made him feel out of place. That sounds weird," he said, looking at her. "Is Kate really okay with something like that?" "Well, you know her," Emily said with a shrug. Her gaze was warm, but John saw her glance away quickly, as if she were afraid he would see something in it. "She always comes up with something unusual. That's okay, John. It might be fun. She leaned over and kissed his cheek, but John felt her fingers tremble slightly as they touched his shoulder. He trusted Emily. They had been together for almost 10 years, and she was everything to him. But this invitation, her nervous smile, the strange name of the club, it all formed a vague pattern that he couldn't quite make out yet. Okay, he said finally, pushing the envelope aside. Let's see what all the fuss is about. But if it turns out to be some weird ritual, I've warned you, I'm out. Emily laughed, genuinely this time, and returned to the stove. We have a deal, hero. No rituals, just dinner and you and me. But when she turned away, John noticed the slight tremor in her hand around the spoon. He decided not to pay attention to it, at least for now. He was tired, and all he wanted was to eat, take a shower, and forget about traffic, work, and that damn envelope. But somewhere deep inside, he felt like this little piece of paper was going to change their lives. Dinner was almost ready, and the kitchen was filled with the rich aroma of tomato ragu with basil and garlic. Emily set the table, placing a steaming plate and a glass of red wine in front of John. The light from the pendant lamp over the kitchen island fell softly on her face, highlighting her delicate features and the slight flush on her cheeks. She looked as charming and cozy as ever, but John couldn't help but feel that there was a quiet energy in her movements, as if she were balancing on the edge between familiar warmth and something new and elusive. He took a sip of wine, feeling the tart taste ease the tension of the day a little, and glanced at the envelope lying on the edge of the counter. The one with the gold lettering and the odd title, Partners Exchange Club. The name still made him vaguely uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was Emily, her slightly nervous smile, the way she quickly looked away when he asked about the invitation. Don't you want to see what's in there? Emily suggested, sitting down across from him with a glass of wine. Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was a subtle note of urgency in it. John shrugged, cutting off a piece of bread. Not really. Something about that name, Partner Swap Club, doesn't inspire confidence. He paused, looking at her. Are you sure this is just a quest or something? Emily smiled, and this time her smile was softer, almost convincing. She leaned a little closer, her fingers lightly brushing his arm. John, it's just a party. Kate loves theatrical things, you know. Remember her masquerade last year? Everyone was running around in superhero costumes, and she made us participate in some stupid superhero posing contest. It's her style. No big deal. He chuckled, remembering that evening. Kate really knew how to put on a show. But something about that envelope, that strange inscription, was bothering him. Maybe so, he said, taking another sip of wine. But the name sounds like, well, you know, like it's more than just a masquerade. Emily laughed, and her laugh was like the ringing of a bell, light but with just the slightest tremor. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, and looked at him with that smile that always made his heart beat a little faster. Oh, John, are you serious? A sex party? She shook her head as if the idea was absurd. It's just a game to keep things interesting. Kate likes to be dramatic. There'll probably be a lot of cocktails, music, and some kind of stupid contest. Let's go have some fun. When was the last time we went out? John had to admit she was right. Their lives had been a never-ending conveyor belt for the last few months. Work, home, the occasional dinner with friends. He missed the times when he and Emily could just run off somewhere to the beach, to the mountains, to a small restaurant on the coast. Her eyes sparkled, and there was something infectious about that sparkle, something that made him feel alive. I don't know, Em, he said, but his voice had softened. My work is a mess as it is. Martin called today, asking about the report again. I'm not sure I'm in the mood for mystery parties. Emily leaned closer, her hand coming over his, warm and soft. Her gaze was warm, but there was a shadow of something else in it, excitement, maybe anticipation. That's exactly why you need a break, she said quietly, almost in a whisper. You think too much about work. Let's just spend the evening together, like we used to. Remember how we danced at Kate's party 2 years ago? You spilled wine on my blouse, and then we laughed until we cried." John couldn't help but smile as he thought back to that evening. Emily had looked like a goddess in her red dress, and despite the ruined blouse, he couldn't take his eyes off her. She always knew how to pull him out of any melancholy, and now, looking at her, he felt his resistance weakening. "You remembered that on purpose, didn't you?" he asked, squinting. "Maybe," she said, her smile widening but still holding that same nervous edge. "Come on, John. It'll be fun, I promise. And if not, we'll just leave early and hit a bar somewhere. Just you and me." He looked at her, trying to figure out what was behind those eyes. Emily was his rock, his best friend, his everything. But something about her insistence, the way she squeezed his hand, her too bright smile, made him feel a little doubt. He pushed the thought away. The fatigue, the traffic, Martin's call, it had all just thrown him off balance. "Okay," he said finally, giving in to her charm. "But if there are any weird contests, I'm out the door. And you're coming with me." Emily laughed, and this time it was genuine, warm, almost like before. She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Agreed, hero. But I'm sure you'll like it." She stood up to clear the plates, and John noticed her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up his empty plate. He decided not to dwell on it, at least for now. The dinner had been delicious, the wine had been gently relaxing, and Emily was there, and that was all that mattered. But somewhere deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the envelope lying on the edge of the counter held something that would change their lives. After dinner, when the last drops of wine had evaporated from the glasses, leaving only a light residue on the glass, John sat back in his chair, watching Emily flit around the kitchen, clearing away the dishes with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. She wasn't just washing the plates, she was polishing them until they shone, rearranging the spices on the shelves, as if she were preparing for some important inspection, and not just for a quiet evening together, which they usually spent watching a movie or leisurely talking about their plans for the weekend. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic. Here she was wiping the countertop in a circular motion, there she was adjusting the napkins in the holder, and there she was, opening the cabinet to make sure all the jars were lined up like soldiers on parade. John felt something unpleasant stir in his chest, like a pang of jealousy, or rather a vague anxiety that grew with every gesture she made, making the air in the room a little thicker, a little heavier. He sat there, rubbing his chin, and thoughts began to flash through his mind, one after another, like flashes in a dark room. Why was she so fussing if this was just an ordinary dinner, where they had already talked about work, about plans, and about that strange envelope that now lay on the edge of the table, like a silent witness to their conversation? Emily was always neat, it was true, but today her preparation seemed exaggerated, as if she were not just cleaning the kitchen, but rehearsing a part in a play where every detail mattered and the slightest mistake could ruin the whole plan. John remembered how she used to prepare for important events, for meeting his parents in the early years of their marriage, for office parties where she had to make an impression, and this was similar, too similar to ignore. But there was nothing special planned today, was there? The envelope with the invitation to that mysterious party still loomed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that her fuss was somehow connected with him, with this partner exchange club, which sounded so ambiguous that he wanted to brush it off, but couldn't. Emily finally finished the dishes and turned to face him, drying her hands on a towel, her smile the same warm, but with that subtle crack he was beginning to notice more and more often. She came closer, sat across from him, and for a moment their eyes met, but she quickly looked away, as if she were afraid he would read something in them he shouldn't. John felt doubts building, like a wave washing up on the shore. Why was she preparing so carefully when it was just an evening at home? Why did her hand shake slightly as she poured herself another glass of water, her eyes constantly sliding to that envelope lying on the table? He trusted her. Of course he did. Emily was his anchor in this crazy world, the person who always stood by him, supported him in difficult moments, like after he lost his job 3 years ago, when she sat up nights with him, planning the future. But now, looking at her, he couldn't ignore those little signals. The nervous glint in her eyes, The way she spoke too quickly during dinner when she was trying to persuade him to go to this party, and now the excessive cleanliness in the kitchen, as if she was trying to wipe not only crumbs from the table, but also some of her own thoughts. He began carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral, not accusatory, but with just the right amount of curiosity to lighten the mood. You're looking a little, especially neat today. Everything's shiny, like in a detergent commercial. Is something wrong? Emily froze for a second, her fingers gripping the towel a little tighter than necessary. But then she laughed the kind of laugh that always broke the tension. But today it seemed a little false to John, like an echo in an empty room. "Oh, John, you always notice," she said, sitting closer and placing her hand on his knee. Her touch was warm, but he felt a slight shudder in it. "I was just tired of the mess, so I decided to clean up properly. Is that bad? You know I like it when my home is cozy." He nodded, but something inside him was nagging. Her explanation sounded logical, but somehow it didn't convince him, as if there was something else hidden behind her words, some kind of understatement that hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. John remembered their conversation at dinner, how she had persuaded him to go to the party, describing how much fun it would be, but avoiding details: who would be there, what exactly Kate was planning, why this particular club with such a provocative name. Doubts flashed through his mind. Maybe she knew more than she was saying. Maybe this was not just an innocent event, but something that could shake up their marriage, test its strength. But no, he pushed the thought away. Emily had never given him a reason to be jealous. She was faithful, loving, the one who shared all his joys and sorrows with him. He decided to trust her, as always, because without trust their relationship would lose its meaning and would become fragile like glass underfoot. However, the words came out as she stood up to put the towel away, and her gaze slid back to the envelope. "Why don't you explain everything?" he asked, his voice coming out a little sharper than he'd intended, with the edge of irritation that had built up over the evening. "About this party, about the club. You say it's just fun, but somehow you avoid the details. Who's going to be there? What's this partner swap? If it's nothing, why don't you just tell me?" Emily stopped, her back stiffening, and turned slowly toward him, her face calm, but her eyes betraying an internal struggle, a mix of guilt, irritation, and something else John couldn't quite place. She sighed, came closer, and sat down in the chair opposite him, taking his hands in hers, her fingers cool despite the warm evening. "John, honey," she said quietly, her voice soft, almost lulling, but with an undertone that made his heart beat faster. "I'm not avoiding, it's just, Kate likes surprises, you know. She said it would be some kind of game, role-playing or teamwork, where couples swap roles or tasks. Nothing intimate, I promise. Why are you suddenly so suspicious? We trust each other, right?" He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth, and for a moment he believed her gaze was sincere, or so he wanted to believe. But the conflict was already there, hidden in those words, in her omissions, in his doubts that did not want to go away. John nodded, squeezed her hands in response, deciding that it was better to trust than to ruin the evening with a quarrel. But something had changed inside him, a small crack in their idyll that could grow if he was not careful. "Okay," he muttered, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess. Let's forget about it and watch a movie." Emily nodded, her smile returning, but John noticed her glance furtively at her watch, as if waiting for something, and it only increased his anxiety, making the night a little darker, a little more mysterious. The drive to the mansion on the invitation led through suburban streets where neatly trimmed lawns and dim streetlights gave the illusion of calm, but John felt his inner tension growing with every mile. Emily sat next to him, wearing a black dress that flowed over her like liquid silk, her fingers nervously adjusting her hair or fiddling with the edge of her handbag. She was silent for most of the drive, only occasionally glancing quickly at John, as if checking to see if he had changed his mind. John, clutching the steering wheel, tried to concentrate on the road, but his thoughts were swirling around that envelope with gold letters and the words Partners Exchange Club, which sounded like a riddle that was haunting him. He tried to convince himself that this was just another one of Kate's eccentric friends, but something about Emily's behavior, her overpreparedness, the slight tremor in her voice, her evasive answers made him feel as if he were going not to a party, but to a meeting with something unknown. When they finally pulled into the driveway, John couldn't help but whistle. The house listed as the location of the party on the invitation was a mansion, 3 stories high, with tall windows framed by wrought iron bars and a wide lawn with perfectly spherical ornamental shrubs gently swaying. Light from the windows spilled onto the gravel path, creating pools of gold, and soft music drifted from a distance, something jazzy, with the smooth lilt of a saxophone mingling with the jasmine-scented evening air. They were met at the gate by a man in a sharp black suit, with a face that looked as if he had spent his whole life practicing neutrality. He checked the invitation, which Emily had pulled out of her purse with barely perceptible haste, and gestured toward the entrance. "Welcome," he said, and his voice was as polished as his appearance, but there was a mechanical coldness to it that sent shivers down John's spine. Emily took John's arm, her fingers lightly squeezing his elbow, and they walked into the foyer. The inside of the mansion was even more impressive than the outside. High ceilings decorated with stucco reflected the soft light of dozens of candles placed on polished wooden tables and windowsills. Candles were everywhere, thin and long in bronze candlesticks, small and round, floating in glass bowls of water, creating an atmosphere that was at once cozy and slightly mystical. Heavy framed paintings adorned the walls, portraits, landscapes, something abstract, but John did not have time to notice the details because his attention immediately switched to the guests. There were about 20 of them, all in small groups, talking quietly among themselves, holding cocktails with brightly colored umbrellas or glasses of sparkling champagne. The men wore dark suits or jackets with perfectly knotted ties, the women in dresses that ranged from elegant to downright daring, but they all looked as if they knew why they were there. Laughter, hushed conversations, and the clink of glasses provided a background that should have been casual, but to John it sounded like a taut string about to snap. The music, more distinct now, poured from invisible speakers, slow, bass-heavy jazz that enveloped but did not soothe, but rather heightened the sense that everything was part of some carefully orchestrated performance. Emily seemed transformed as soon as they entered. Her shoulders straightened, her smile broadened, her movements more confident, as if she had shaken off that slight trace of nervousness John had noticed at home. She let go of his hand and immediately moved toward the group of 3 people standing by the fireplace, where the wood was crackling, adding a faint scent of smoke to the air. John stood in the doorway, feeling out of place. He was not a fan of social events, especially ones where everyone seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. His gaze swept over the guests, trying to find Kate, but she was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he noticed Emily already laughing at something said by a tall man in a gray suit, whose smile seemed at once charming and predatory. "John, come here," Emily called, turning to him and waving. Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was the same note in it that had alerted him back home, something she wasn't telling him, something that was hiding behind her smile. He approached reluctantly, feeling the gazes of several guests sliding over him, assessing him as if he were a new exhibit in a museum. Emily introduced him. "This is my husband, John. John, this is Liam." She pointed to the man in the gray suit, who extended his hand with such confidence, as if he was used to everyone around him following his rhythm. "Pleased to meet you, John," Liam said, his voice deep and slightly accented, something John couldn't quite place. "Kate's told me a lot about you. She said you were a man of character." John shook his hand, but something inside him twisted. Liam was looking at him too closely, and his smile, though friendly, made John feel like he was playing a game he didn't know the rules of. He glanced at Emily, waiting for her to explain who Liam was and why Kate had even mentioned him, but she had already turned away, deep in conversation with a woman in a red dress whose earrings sparkled like little stars in the candlelight. "Is Kate here?" John asked, trying to keep his voice even, but feeling irritation began to boil inside. He didn't like being left in the dark, and standing in the middle of this strange gathering, he felt exactly that way out of place, as if everyone around him knew something he didn't. Liam tilted his head slightly, his eyes glittering. "Oh, Kate's around here somewhere," he said, making a vague gesture with his hand. "She likes to make a splash, grab a cocktail and relax. The evening is just getting started." John nodded, but instead of following her advice, he stood where he was, watching Emily ease into the conversation. She laughed, touched the woman in the red dress's arm, nodded when Liam said something, and looked like she was here before. It wasn't like her usual behavior at parties. She usually stayed close to him, especially in unfamiliar company, but now she seemed to disappear into the crowd, leaving him alone. John felt something heavy brewing in his chest, a mixture of resentment and suspicion that he tried to push away, but which stubbornly returned. He walked over to the bar, where a young bartender in a white shirt was expertly mixing cocktails, adding lime wedges and sprigs of mint to the shaker. John ordered a whiskey on the rocks, hoping the strong drink would help him relax, but after taking his first sip, he realized it wouldn't. The atmosphere around him was too strange. Candles, music, perfectly dressed people exchanging glances as if sharing secrets that no one was saying out loud. He noticed one couple, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a woman in a green dress, exchange a quick glance with another couple, and then both men laughed, as if they were sharing some kind of joke. John felt even more of a stranger, as if he had accidentally walked into a closed meeting where everyone knew everyone else except him. He turned back to Emily, who was now standing by the large window overlooking the garden, talking to Liam and another woman whose hair was pulled back into an elaborate updo adorned with glittering pins. Emily looked animated, her cheeks slightly flushed, either from the cocktail or from the excitement she couldn't hide. John moved closer, trying to follow the conversation, but they were talking about something abstract travel, some wine tour of Tuscany that Liam had supposedly organized last summer. John tried to fit in, but his words sounded awkward, as if he were trying to speak a language he didn't understand. "Are you okay?" he asked Emily quietly, leaning towards her so that the others wouldn't hear him. She turned to him, and for a moment her eyes met his, but there was a shadow in them, either irritation or concern. "Sure," she said, smiling, but it was too quick, too rehearsed. "Just relax, John. Talk to people, have a drink. It's just a party." "Just a party," he repeated, but his voice was quieter than he'd intended, and there was a note of doubt in it. "Then why does this all feel, I don't know, staged?" Emily frowned, but immediately pulled herself together, her hand falling on his shoulder, and she squeezed it lightly, as if trying to calm him down. "John, you're overthinking it," she said, lowering her voice. "These are just people who want to have fun. Kate always does something unusual, you know? Give it a chance." He wanted to protest, to say that this wasn't like Kate's usual antics, that there were too many unsaid words, too many looks that said more than words ever could, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded and walked over to the wall, leaning against it and watching the crowd. Emily returned to her conversation, and John noticed the way Liam leaned a little closer to her than he should have, the way his hand brushed her elbow, and the way she didn't pull away. It was a small thing, but to John it was like a spark that could start a fire. He took another sip of whiskey, the cold ice burning his tongue, and tried to distract himself, but his gaze kept returning to Emily. She was laughing, her head thrown back slightly, the candlelight reflecting off her eyes, making them brighter, more alive. She was in her element, but John couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a party. Something in the air, in these people, in their too practical movements and smiles, hinted that there was more behind the facade. He noticed how one woman, standing nearby, put her hand on the shoulder of a man who was clearly not her date, and how her date, standing off to the side, watched with a smile that seemed either approving or forced. John felt his stomach clench. "Hey, you're new, huh?" a voice said next to him, and John turned to see a woman in her mid-30s, with short dark hair and eyes that glittered like a cat about to pounce. She was holding a cocktail filled with bright pink liquid and looking at him curiously. "You could say that," John replied, trying to sound friendly but not overly interested. "And you?" "Oh, I'm a regular here," she said, taking a sip and tilting her head slightly. "My name is Layla. This is my home, by the way. Welcome." John raised his eyebrows, surprised. He had expected this to be Kate's house, but Leela, he had never heard that name before. "Your house?" he asked. "I thought this was Kate's party." Layla laughed, and her laugh was low, almost hoarse, as if she knew something he didn't. "Kate's a good friend of mine," she replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "She helps me with the organization. She has a talent for bringing together interesting people. And you, John, what brings you here?" He opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. What had brought him here? Emily, of course, but now he wasn't sure that was the only reason. He glanced at his wife, who was now standing next to Liam and another couple, and felt his heart clench. Leela followed his gaze and smiled, but there was something about that smile that made John even more wary. "Don't worry," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "This is all about pleasure. The key is openness. You're open to new things, aren't you?" John didn't answer, just took another sip of whiskey, feeling the drink burn his throat. He didn't know what to say, because at that moment he realized this wasn't just a party. And whatever this was, he was already caught up in a game whose rules no one had explained to him. The candles in Leela's mansion were still burning, their flames wavering slightly in the draft, but the light they cast seemed increasingly ominous to John, as if every shadow on the walls hid something he didn't want to see. The music, still slow jazz, was now mocking, its soft chords only accentuating the storm that was building in his chest. He stood against the wall, clutching his empty whiskey glass, and looked at Emily, who was still talking to Liam and the woman in the red dress. Her laughter, so familiar, now cut into his ears, as if it belonged to someone other than the Emily he had known for 10 years. Leela's announcement of the game of swapping partners still hummed in his head like the echo of a distant explosion, and every glance Emily exchanged with Liam, every gesture she made, seemed to John to be proof that she knew more than she was letting on. He tried to keep his composure, reminding himself that Emily was his wife, his best friend, the person who had been there for him in his darkest moments. But Leela's words, her knowing smile, and the way Emily had blended so easily into the crowd added fuel to his doubts. The jealousy he had tried to suppress was now bubbling to the surface, mingling with hurt and betrayal. He felt betrayed not just by being at this strange party, but by the fact that Emily seemed to know what they were getting into and hadn't warned him. Why hadn't she told him everything? Why had she brought him here, to this house full of people whose smiles seemed like masks hiding something dark? John took a step forward, his movements jerky, almost uncontrollable. He crossed the room, ignoring the glances of the guests, who seemed to have noticed his tension and were now watching him with curiosity, as if he were an animal released from a cage. Emily, sensing his approach, turned, her smile faltering as she saw the expression on his face. Liam and the woman in the red dress fell silent, their gazes flickering to John, but he ignored them. His world had narrowed to Emily, to her eyes, which were now looking at him with concern. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost growling, with that huskiness that betrayed the storm inside. "Right now." Emily frowned, her hand instinctively reaching for his elbow, but he pulled away, and the gesture, so small yet so meaningful, made her freeze. "John, what happened?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light, but he could hear her tone shaking, as if she knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "What happened?" he asked, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "You brought me here, to this damn party, without telling me what I was getting into. Partner swapping. Seriously, Emily? You knew this was coming, and you didn't even think to warn me." Her eyes widened, and she glanced around quickly, noticing several couples turning to look at them, their conversations quieting and their gazes curious, almost predatory. Emily took a step closer to John, her hand reaching out to him again, but he stepped back, the step like a wall he had erected between them. "John, please, not here," she whispered, her voice pleading but with a hint of irritation. "You're making a scene out of this. It's just a game, I told you." "Game," he almost shouted the word, and now everyone in the room turned to look at them. The music was still playing, but it seemed distant, like someone had turned off the sound in the real world, leaving only the sound of their argument. You knew Leela was going to announce this partner swap crap, and you didn't even think to tell me. You saw how I reacted to that envelope at home, Emily. You saw that I wasn't thrilled, but you dragged me here anyway. Why can't you be honest with me? Her face went pale, and for a moment she looked as if she had been struck. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words stuck, and instead she pressed her lips together, her eyes shining with what might have been anger or tears. The guests around him began to whisper, their eyes like needles piercing John, but he didn't care. He could feel his heart pounding, the blood pounding in his temples, and all he wanted was to understand why Emily, his Emily, had done this to him. John, I didn't mean to upset you, she said finally, her voice quieter but still steely, defensive. I thought you'd be open to something new. Kate said it was just a way to shake things up, to try something different. I didn't know Leela would take it that way. I thought it would be fun. Fun, John laughed, but his laugh was bitter, almost venomous. You think it's funny to bring me here, where people are going to swap partners, and not even tell me? You saw the way I looked at that envelope, Emily. You knew what I'd think, and you still didn't say anything. Is this your style now, to keep me in the dark? Her eyes flashed, and she sat up straighter, her voice sharper, as if she could no longer contain her own irritation. What did you want, John? For me to explain everything to you like a child? I tried to explain, but you immediately start suspecting me of something. I wanted us to spend time together, to get out of this routine that you drown in because of your work. Do you think I don't see how exhausted you are? How come you come home and don't even look at me because you're thinking about your reports and calls from Martin? I wanted us to shake things up, to feel alive again. Her words hit him like a slap in the face, and he was silent for a moment, feeling the air between them grow thick, almost tangible. The guests around him stopped pretending not to listen. Their eyes were openly curious, some even smiling, as if this quarrel was part of the fun. John felt his face heat up, not just with anger, but with humiliation. He hated being the center of attention, and hated that their private moment had become a spectacle for these strangers. You could have just told me the truth, he said, his voice quieter but hurt. You could have told me what kind of party this was, and we could have decided together whether to go or not. But instead, you dragged me here, and now I'm standing here like an idiot, not understanding what's going on. This isn't about trust, Emily. This is about you deciding for me. Emily opened her mouth to reply, but her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly turned away, clenching her fists. She took a step back, as if to hide from his words, but then turned back to him, her voice shaking but full of determination. I didn't mean for you to feel this way, she said. I thought it would be an adventure. I thought we could handle it. But if that's how you want to go, go. I'm not holding you back. The words were like a punch to the gut, and John felt his heart squeeze. He looked at her face, which was at once so familiar and so foreign in that moment, and he realized that he could no longer remain in this room, among these people, under their gaze. He turned without a word and walked quickly toward the exit, feeling his footsteps echoing in his ears, as if he were running from something he could not explain. The door opened onto the garden, and the cold night air hit him in the face like a slap. He stopped on the gravel path, breathing in the scent of jasmine and damp grass, and tried to calm his breathing. The candles, the music, the voices of the guests were behind him, but their echoes still echoed in his head, mingling with Emily's voice, with her accusations and excuses. He felt lost, as if the world he knew was crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. John leaned against a tree, his hands shaking, and closed his eyes, trying to figure out what to do next. Go back to Emily and try to fix everything, or walk away, leaving this evening behind like a bad dream. The night air in Leela's garden was cool, scented with jasmine and damp earth, but to John it felt heavy, as if saturated with his own rage and confusion. He leaned against the trunk of an old oak tree, its branches casting long shadows across the gravel path, lit only by the dim light of the lanterns. His heart was still pounding, as if he had been running, and his mind was spinning with Emily's words, her accusations, her excuses, and the way she looked at him, with pain but also with a strange determination that only increased his sense of betrayal. He couldn't go back to the house, where the candles and the music and the gazes of the guests seemed part of some alien world into which he had been dragged without asking. He wanted to leave, to get into the car and drive home, but his feet were rooted to the ground, held by an invisible thread, the same thread that had connected him to Emily all these years. The door to the mansion creaked, and John heard light footsteps on the gravel. He didn't turn around, but he knew it was her. Her presence was as familiar as the rhythm of his own breathing, even with the wall between them. Emily stopped a few steps away from him, and he heard her sigh softly before speaking. John, her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was a tremor in it, as if she were afraid he would turn away again. Please talk to me. He clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms, and turned slowly. Emily stood before him, her black dress billowing slightly in the breeze, the light from the lantern reflected in her eyes, making them glitter as if they were filled with tears. She looked vulnerable, but at the same time determined, and the combination only increased his confusion. He wanted to scream, wanted to leave, but instead he simply pointed to a bench nearby, under a spreading tree, where the shadows hid them from the light of the mansion's windows. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was hoarse, as if the words were scraping his throat. "If you want to talk, talk. But I don't know what you can say to fix this." Emily nodded, her movements slow, almost cautious, as if she were afraid to startle him. They sat down on the bench, the cold wood the only thing real in this nightmare. She folded her hands in her lap, her fingers intertwined nervously, and for a moment the silence between them was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. John looked out into the darkness of the garden, where the bushes and flowers were lost in shadow, and waited, feeling his heart tighten with pain and anger. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way," Emily began, her voice quiet, but with a sincerity that made John tense even more. "I didn't want you to feel cheated. I thought, I thought this would be our chance." "A chance?" he asked, turning to her so abruptly that she flinched. His eyes were blazing, and he made no attempt to hide his disappointment. "A chance for what, Emily? For me to watch you flirt with this Liam? For me to stand there and listen as Leela suggests that we swap partners? Do you seriously think that's what I want?" She pressed her lips together, her eyes brightening as she blinked rapidly to hold back tears. Her hands shook, and she removed them from her lap, tucking them under the hem of her dress, as if trying to hide her vulnerability. "No, John," she said, her voice a little louder, but still shaking. "This isn't about flirting or whatever you think. I wanted us to come alive, to feel like us again. You see what's happening, right? We're stuck. You come home and all you think about is your work, your reports, your Martin. And me? I just cook dinner and wait for you to notice me. I'm tired of just being part of your routine." Her words hit him like a cold wind, and he paused for a moment, trying to process them. He knew she was right, at least partly. The last few months had been tough. Deadlines at work, pressure from his boss, endless nights spent working on his laptop while Emily slept in the next room. He'd seen her try cooking his favorite stew, suggesting spontaneous outings, trying to pull him out of this gray haze, but he'd always brushed it off, citing fatigue or another project. But this party, this partner swap, it wasn't a solution, it was a betrayal. "And you decided to bring me here, where people gather to, what? Swap wives and husbands." His voice was shaking with anger, and he leaned closer to her, his eyes searching hers, but she was looking down at her hands. "This is your way of spicing up our marriage. Do you even realize what this looks like? Do you even realize how I feel when I see you laughing with this Liam guy like you're not here with me?" Emily's head snapped up, her eyes flashing, more anger than tears now in them. "Don't you dare accuse me of something that isn't true," she said, her voice sharpening as if she couldn't hold it in any longer. "I wasn't flirting with Liam, I was just talking. You're the one who keeps seeing things that aren't true. I wanted us to try something new, to get out of this routine where I feel invisible. Kate said it was a game, that it was just a way to shake things up, meet new people, feel freer. I didn't know Leela would put it that way. I didn't think you'd take it that way. You didn't know? John laughed, but his laugh was bitter, like poison. Emily, you saw this envelope. You knew the name of this club. You couldn't have failed to understand that this wasn't just a fun game. You brought me here knowing what I would think, and you didn't even warn me. This is not trust, Emily. This is... this is betrayal. The word betrayal hung in the air like a stone dropped into water, and Emily froze, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. One tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail, and she quickly wiped it away, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold them in place. Betrayal, she whispered, and her voice was so fragile that John felt his own heart squeeze. Do you really think I'd betray you, after everything we've been through? After I was there when you lost your job, when your mother was sick, when you said you didn't want kids and I agreed because I loved you? Do you really think I could, that I'd want to? She paused, choking on her tears, and turned away, her shoulders shaking. John watched her, and his anger began to dissolve, replaced by a pain that was deeper than he had expected. He saw her tears, saw her struggling, and part of him wanted to hold her, to tell her it would be okay, but another part, the part that still felt the sting of jealousy, hurt, betrayal, wouldn't let him move. He saw their marriage, which he had thought unbreakable, beginning to crumble at the seams right here on this bench, under the cold light of the street lamps. Then why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quieter but still hurt. Why didn't you tell me what kind of party this was? You knew I didn't sign up for this, Emily. You knew I didn't want any games with other people. Why did you decide for me? Emily turned to him, her face wet with tears, but she made no attempt to hide them. She looked at him, and there was such a mixture of despair and love in her gaze that John felt his own eyes begin to burn. Because I was afraid, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I was afraid you'd say no, that you'd retreat back into your work, into your reports, into your world where I had no place. I wanted us to be together again, John. Not just husband and wife, eating dinner and watching TV, but a real couple, living, breathing, feeling. I thought this could be the beginning of something new. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Her words were like a knife that pierced his heart, and John felt his anger finally dissolve, leaving only emptiness and pain. He looked at her tear-stained face, at her trembling hands, and he knew that their marriage, as it had been before, could never be restored. This night, this conversation, this bench, all of it was the point where something had broken, and he didn't know if it could be fixed. I don't know how to move forward, he said finally, his voice hoarse, as if the words were being forced out. I love you, Emily, but right now, I don't know how to trust you. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. John looked at her, feeling his own heart breaking, but he couldn't bring himself to touch her, couldn't bridge the gap that had grown between them in one evening. He stood, his legs heavy as lead, and took a step back, looking at her, at their marriage crumbling before his eyes. I need time, he said quietly, and those were the last words he could squeeze out before he turned and walked into the darkness of the garden, leaving Emily alone on the bench, with her tears and their broken hopes. John drove home in silence, broken only by the monotonous hum of the engine and the occasional honk of a horn on the freeway south of Los Angeles. The streetlights along the road cast long shadows that slid across the windshield like the ghosts of his own thoughts. He had left the party alone, leaving Emily in Leela's garden, on the bench where their conversation had become an open wound. Her tear-stained face, her trembling voice, her words about wanting to spice up their relationship still echoed in his head, but instead of bringing him clarity, they only drove him deeper into confusion. John gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, and every turn in the road seemed like a step further from what he considered his home, his life, his Emily. When he entered the house, the darkness greeted him like an old enemy. The light in the hallway was off, and only the dim glow of a street lamp filtered through the curtains, illuminating the familiar shapes of the furniture. John threw his keys on the table, and their jingle echoed in the emptiness. The house that had always been their refuge, The place where he and Emily had laughed, argued, made plans, now seemed alien, as if someone had taken the soul out of it. He walked into the kitchen, where there were still traces of their dinner last night. 2 plates in the sink, a bottle of wine half empty, and a single candle that had burned down to its base, leaving only a puddle of wax on the tablecloth. These little things, so familiar, now seemed like fragments of another life, the one before the party, before the argument, before the moment when he saw something in Emily's eyes that he could not understand. There was a note on the kitchen island, written in her neat handwriting. John froze, his hand shaking before he took the paper. "John, I'm going to see Kate for a few days. I need time. I'm sorry. Emily." Each word was a blow, short and precise, but together they added up to an admission that their marriage, their unbreakable bond, was now hanging by a thread. He read the note over, hoping to find something else in it, an explanation, a promise, some hint that they could fix this, but there was only that. Cold, terse words written in a trembling hand. He crumpled the paper in his fist, feeling the anger and hurt warring inside him, but neither could fill the emptiness that grew with each passing second. John walked into the living room and collapsed on the couch without turning on the light. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on the coffee table of him and Emily on the beach in Santa Barbara 2 years ago. She was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, and he had his arms around her, feeling like the luckiest man in the world. Now the photograph seemed like a taunt, a reminder of what he had lost, or maybe never really had. He closed his eyes, and an internal monologue began in his head that he couldn't stop. How did we get here? He thought, replaying their conversation on the bench in his mind. Her admission that she wanted to spice up their relationship sounded sincere, but why did it feel like a betrayal? He knew the last few months had been hard, his obsession with work, the endless deadlines, the calls from Martin that haunted him. He had seen Emily try, how she tried to bring the spark back into their lives, but he had brushed it off, thinking that they had time, that they would always be together, that their love was something unshakable. But now, sitting in an empty house, he realized that he had been wrong. She wanted something more, and he hadn't noticed how she was moving away, how her smiles became rarer, her looks more anxious. And yet, why had she chosen these? Why this party, this partner swap club, this Layla with her predatory smile? He felt cheated, but also guilty, and this duality was tearing him apart from the inside. Meanwhile, Emily sat in Kate's spare room, looking out the window at the twinkling lights of the suburbs. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched the cold cup of tea Kate had put in front of her an hour ago. She had left without waiting for John because she couldn't stand the look in his eyes any longer, the same look of pain and blame that told her she had ruined something precious. She knew he wouldn't come back for her at the party, she knew he would go home, and that knowledge only made her feel more guilty. She wanted to text him, to call him, to explain, but every time she picked up the phone, her fingers froze. What could she say? That she had been wrong? That she hadn't meant for things to turn out this way? It was true, but the truth seemed too fragile to withstand his wrath. Her thoughts swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. I wanted to save us, she thought, remembering the first time she'd heard about the party from Kate. Her friend had described it as an adventure, a way to shake things up, to break out of the routine that was stifling their marriage. Emily had seen John withdraw, his mind consumed by work, his ignorance of her not out of anger, but simply because his world had narrowed to reports and deadlines. She missed him, the John who would spontaneously drag her to the beach or dance with her in the rain. She'd thought that this party, with its provocative play, might have awakened something in him, reminded him that they were alive, that they belonged together. But instead it had ruined everything. His words on the bench, "This is a betrayal," echoed in her head, and every time she remembered them, her heart ached. Emily knew she should have told him the truth from the start, explained that Kate had convinced her that this would be an innocent game, that no one would force them to do anything they didn't want to do. But she was afraid that he would refuse, that he would retreat back into his shell, and she would lose him not all at once, but slowly, day by day, until their marriage was an empty shell. She had taken a risk, and now she was paying for it, sitting in a strange house, away from her husband, away from the home they had built together. John, sitting in the darkness of the living room, was also silent. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't pick up his phone, didn't try to distract himself. He just sat there, looking at the photograph on the table, his thoughts swirling around one question: can this be fixed? He loved Emily, loved her so much that the thought of life without her seemed unbearable. But now he didn't know how to get past this pain, this sense of betrayal that was poisoning his thoughts. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that she didn't want to hurt him, but every time he remembered her smile at Liam, her ease at that party, her omissions, his heart sank with a new wave of doubt. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence was like a mirror reflecting their mistakes. There was a plate in the kitchen with the remains of the dinner Emily had cooked the night before, and John suddenly remembered her bustling about the stove, her hair falling over her face, her smile at him despite his fatigue. The memory was like a knife in his chest, because it reminded him that he was guilty too. He hadn't noticed her, hadn't heard her, hadn't seen her trying to reach out to him. But that didn't excuse her, couldn't excuse her bringing him to this party without telling him the truth. Emily, sitting at Kate's, was also thinking about yesterday. She remembered the way John had looked at her when he found the envelope, his eyebrows raised in surprise, his attempt to joke to hide his worry. She knew she should have told him then, but instead she had hidden behind a smile, behind the words, "It was just fun." Now she was alone, in a strange room, and her thoughts were full of regret. What if he doesn't forgive me? She thought, squeezing the cup so hard that her fingers turned white. What if this is the end? They were both silent, separated by the miles and the gap that had grown between them overnight. John looked at the empty sofa where Emily usually sat curled up and felt his heart breaking. Emily looked out the window at the dark streets and imagined John sitting in their living room, alone, with the same pain that tormented her. Neither of them knew how to take a step towards each other, how to overcome this silence that was louder than any argument. Their marriage, which had seemed unbreakable to them, was now hanging by a thin thread, and each of them was afraid that it was about to break. A week had passed since that fateful night in Leela's mansion, and the house that John and Emily had once considered their refuge had become a deserted fortress, where every corner was a reminder of what had been lost. John lived these days in a strange numbness, balancing between anger, longing, and the debilitating emptiness that had settled in his chest. He went to work, answered Martin's calls, wrote reports, but it was all mechanical, as if his body moved by inertia, and his soul remained somewhere in Leela's garden, on the bench where his and Emily's words had torn their world apart. The house was too quiet without her footsteps on the wooden floor, without her habit of humming under her breath, without her laughter that used to fill the space with warmth. Now there was silence, interrupted only by the creaking of the old refrigerator or the occasional noise of cars outside the window. Every night, John would come home to find the same remnants of their last fight. A crumpled note from Emily on the kitchen island that he had never thrown away, leftovers from dinner in the fridge that he couldn't bring himself to eat, and a photograph on the coffee table of him and Emily smiling on the beach in Santa Barbara. The photograph was both comforting and tormenting, a reminder of what they had and what might never come back. He'd tried to distract himself by turning on the TV or scrolling through his phone, but his thoughts would inevitably return to her. Her tear-stained eyes, her shaky voice, her words about wanting to spice up their marriage. He was angry at her for bringing him to that party, for keeping the truth from him, but at the same time, he couldn't help but admit that some of the blame lay with him. He didn't notice how she was moving away, how her smiles became less frequent, how she was trying to reach him through his wall of work and fatigue. This duality, anger at her and a sense of his own guilt, was tearing him apart, like two opposing currents pulling him in different directions. Emily, meanwhile, had spent the week at Kate's, in her small apartment on the outskirts of town. She slept on the fold-out couch in the living room, surrounded by Kate's books and her vinyl collection, but even this cozy environment couldn't drown out the noise inside her. Every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and replayed their fight in her head, every word, every look of pain and accusation from John. She saw his face when he said he didn't know how to trust her, and those words were like the knife she had stabbed into their marriage. Emily knew she had made a mistake, knew she should have told him about the party, about how Kate had convinced her it would be a fun game, a way to shake things up. But she was afraid he would refuse, that he would retreat back into his world where she didn't belong, and that fear had pushed her to take what now seemed to her the biggest mistake of their lives. She tried calling him, texting him, but she stopped each time before hitting the send button. What could she say? "I'm sorry, I was stupid. I didn't mean to hurt you." The words seemed empty, unable to heal the wound she had inflicted. Kate, seeing her state, tried to console her, offered wine, conversation, distraction, but Emily couldn't get out of her thoughts. She missed John, their home, their life, but most of all she was afraid that he wouldn't forgive her, that their marriage, which they had built for 10 years, would now crumble like a house of cards. On the seventh day, she couldn't take it anymore. In the morning, after Kate had left for work, Emily packed her bag, left a thank you note, and drove home. The drive seemed endless, every stoplight, every traffic jam adding to her anxiety. She imagined walking into the house, meeting John's gaze, and she didn't know what she would say, but she knew she had to try. She loved him so much that the thought of life without him was like a void she didn't want to look into. When she finally parked outside their house, her hands were shaking, and she sat in the car for a few minutes, steeling herself before opening the door. John was home. He was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and on the table was the same crumpled note she had left a week ago. He looked up at the sound of the door opening, and their eyes met. His face was tired, drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Emily felt her heart clench, and she paused in the doorway, unsure of where to begin. "John," she said quietly, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I'm back." He looked at her, and there was a mixture of emotions in his eyes that he couldn't quite place: relief, anger, pain, love. He wanted to get up, to hug her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but the memories of that night, of her unspoken words, of her smile at Liam, held him in place like an anchor. "I see," he replied, and his voice was even, but there was a coldness in it that made Emily shudder. "Why did you come back?" She took a step forward, her bag slipped off her shoulder and fell to the floor, but she didn't pay attention to it. Her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't try to hide them, as she had done before. She wanted him to see her pain, her regret, her love. "Because I love you," she said, her voice hoarse, almost breaking. "Because I can't live without you. I know I made a mistake, John. I should have told you about that party. I should have been honest. I thought it would be fun, that it would make us, I don't know, feel alive. But I was wrong. I was so wrong, and I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try. Please, give me a chance." John looked at her, and his heart broke. He saw her tears, saw her shaking, her hands clenching into fists to stop the shaking, and part of him wanted to go over to her, to hold her, to tell her they could make it. But the other part of him, the part that still remembered her smile at that party, her unspoken words, her ease among those strangers, wouldn't let him move. He felt betrayed, and it was like a poison that was slowly eating away at his love for her. "You say you love me," he said finally, and his voice was quiet, but there was a pain in it that had been building all week. "But how can I trust you, Emily? You brought me there knowing what I would think, knowing it wasn't just a party. You saw how I reacted to that envelope, and you still didn't say anything. How can I trust you after that?" Emily sniffled, her shoulders slumping, and she stepped closer, sitting in the chair across from him. Her hands were on the table, and she was looking at them, as if she was afraid to meet his gaze. "I know I let you down," she said, and every word was a confession torn from deep within. "I thought this would be an adventure, that we could shake things up, that it would take us back to who we used to be. You don't notice, John, but we were drifting apart. You were so wrapped up in your work, so locked in your own world, that I felt invisible. I wanted you to see me again, to feel like we were living, not just existing. But I chose the wrong way. I didn't mean to hurt you, I swear. I love you so much that I couldn't watch us lose to each other anymore." Her words were like a knife that pierced his heart, because they were true. John knew she was right. He could see how his obsession with work, his exhaustion, his detachment were creating a chasm between them. He remembered the nights he'd come home and sit silently at his laptop while Emily cooked dinner, the way he'd brushed off her offers to go out, the way he'd ignored her attempts to reach out to him. But that didn't change what she'd done, didn't change the fact that she'd hidden the truth, that she'd brought him to that house where it all felt like a game, but like a betrayal. "You wanted me to see you," he said, his voice cold despite the pain that was tearing him apart inside. "But instead, I saw you laughing with Liam, blending into that crowd like you belonged there. You think that doesn't hurt? You think I can just forget about it? You brought me there, Emily, and you didn't even give me a choice. You decided for me, and now you say you love me. But love isn't that. Love is trust, and I don't know how to trust you now." Emily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and John felt his own eyes begin to burn. He hated himself for hurting her, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't swallow the pain that was burning inside him. He looked at her tear-stained face, at her shaking hands, and he knew that their marriage, their love, their life were hanging by a thread now, and he didn't know if they had the strength to hold on to her. "I don't know what to do," she said finally, lifting her head and looking at him. Her eyes were red, but there was a determination in them, as if she were clinging to her last hope. "I know it's my fault. I know I've let you down. But I love you, John, and I want to fight for us. Tell me what to do. Tell me how I can earn your trust back." He looked at her, his heart torn between love and pain, between wanting to hold her and fearing he'd never forget that night. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe they could get through this, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her at that party, saw Leela with her predatory smile, saw Liam standing too close. The images were like a poison he didn't know how to get out of his system. "I need time," he said finally, his voice hoarse, as if the words were being forced out. "I don't know, Emily. I love you, but I don't know how to get over this. I don't know if I can trust you again. I need time to understand." Emily nodded, her lips trembling, but she didn't object. She stood up, her movements slow, almost mechanical, and she looked at him as if she wanted to memorize his face, as if she was afraid it would be the last time. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll give you time. But I'm not leaving, John. I'll be here when you're ready. I love you." She turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving him alone in the kitchen. John watched her go, his heart aching. He didn't know if their marriage had a chance, didn't know if he could ever forget that night, if he could ever look at Emily again without suspicion. He sat in the dark, staring at the crumpled note that still lay on the table, wondering if their love was enough to bridge the gap, or if it was already too deep. Emily lay in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her mind full of doubt. She knew she was guilty. She knew her decision had brought them to this, but she also knew she loved John more than anything. She thought back to their early years, their spontaneous trips, their nights talking until the early hours, and those memories were like a light in the darkness that she didn't want to lose. But his words, "I need time," sounded like a death sentence, and she was afraid that time would only increase the distance between them. They were both lying in separate rooms, separated not only by walls, but by their doubts, their pain, their love, which now seemed both their salvation and their curse. Their marriage was hanging by a thread, and neither of them knew if they had the strength to hold it together. It had been weeks since that attempted reconciliation, when Emily had come home with tears in her eyes and hope in her eyes, and John had sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and said those words, "I need time," that hung in the air like a heavy fog, enveloping them both and preventing them from seeing the way forward. And now, after those long days of silent dinners where forks banged against plates as if trying to fill the void of conversations that had never happened, they had finally come to what had seemed inevitable, an appointment with a lawyer where their marriage, once full of laughter and promise, would be torn apart at the page, like an old photograph torn in half in a fit of anger, except that there was no anger here, only a deep, all-consuming sadness that permeated every cell of their bodies, making their movements slow and heavy like they were treading water. It hadn't come suddenly, like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. It had matured gradually, like a fruit that seemed sweet at first, but eventually rotted from the inside, and whose idea it had been the divorce it was hard to say for sure now, because in their conversations, those rare moments when they tried to talk and not just exist, the blame had been thrown from one to the other like a hot potato that neither of them wanted to hold for too long. But it had all started that night when John, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling where the cracks reminded him of the cracks in their relationship, had thought that maybe it was better to let each other go than to cling to something that could never be returned, and the next day he had said it to Emily at breakfast, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid that the words spoken out loud would make everything irreversible. Emily, he began, stirring his coffee, which had gone cold, but he still held the cup in his hands as if it were an anchor keeping him from falling into the abyss. I think we need to. Think about a divorce. I can't do this anymore. I love you, but every time I look at you, I see that party, I see how you hid the truth from me, and it kills me inside. I've tried to forgive, I've tried to understand, but I can't. Emily, sitting across from him, holding a piece of toast that she never brought to her mouth, froze, her eyes widened, and for a moment it looked like she was about to burst into tears, but instead she set the toast down on her plate, her movements precise, almost mechanical, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, and answered, her voice even but cracked, like old glass about to shatter. "This was your idea, John?" she asked, looking him straight in the eye, a mixture of pain and relief in her eyes, because finally someone had said it out loud, something that had been hanging between them all these days, like a ghost they both saw but didn't dare name. "You think divorce is the answer? After everything we've been through? I came back to fight for us, but if you've already given up, maybe you're right. Maybe it's my fault that we got into this. I hid the truth about the party because I was afraid of losing you, but I ended up losing you anyway. Whose idea was this? Mine, probably, because I started this mess. But if you want a divorce, go ahead. I won't hold on to something that's already broken." John felt his heart tighten because there was a truth in her words that he didn't want to admit. It wasn't just his idea, but hers too, in a way, because her actions, her decision to bring him to that party, had been the catalyst that had started a chain reaction, and now they were both standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss where the pieces of their marriage lay, and he responded, his voice a little louder, as if he was trying to convince not only her but himself as well. "No, Emily, it's not just your fault," he said, pushing his cup away because the coffee suddenly tasted as bitter as their conversation. "It's my fault, too. I didn't notice you, didn't see you trying to save us. I was so caught up in work, in Martin, in those endless reports that seemed more important to me than us. You wanted to shake us up, and I understand why you chose that path, but it was the wrong one, and now I can't forget. Every time I think about trust, I remember the way you smiled at Liam, the way you blended into that crowd, and it's like a knife in the back. The idea of divorce? It came to me because I was tired of fighting these memories. But if you think we can try again, tell me. Tell me this isn't the end." Emily shook her head, the tears finally rolling down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with her sleeve. Her movements were sharp, as if she was angry at herself for being weak, and she answered, her voice shaking, but with a determination that scared John because he knew what it meant. She had come to the same conclusion, too. "I tried, John. I came back, I apologized, I told you I loved you, but you said, I need time, and that time just made it worse. We live like strangers in the same house. We don't even really talk. Whose idea was this? Maybe it was both of ours. Because we both let this happen. You don't trust me, and I'm tired of proving that I'm not a traitor. I hid the truth, yes, but not to hurt you, but to save us. But it didn't work. So let's get a divorce. Maybe it's better for both of us." And after that conversation, everything had gone smoothly. They had found a lawyer recommended by a mutual friend who specialized in friendly divorces, where couples didn't tear each other apart in court, but simply signed papers, dividing up assets and memories with the same cold calculation with which one splits a restaurant bill after a bad date. And now, on this rainy day, when the sky over Los Angeles was gray as their mood, They were sitting in the lawyer's office at a large wooden table covered with stacks of documents that seemed to John too formal, too final for what had once been their lives. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, with a sharp suit and a kind smile that didn't reach her eyes, spread the papers out in front of them, her voice professionally calm, as if she were talking about the weather rather than the end of their marriage. "So, John and Emily," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose, "we've checked everything. The property is divided equally. Emily gets the house, John gets the car, and the savings are split evenly. No kids, no arguments. This is one of the easiest cases I've seen. Are you sure you want to sign? Any doubts?" John looked at Emily, sitting opposite him, her hair pulled back into a bun and her eyes darkened by sleepless nights, and he felt a pang of pain because even now, at this moment, he loved her, but the love was mixed with a bitterness that wouldn't let him retreat. "I'm sure," he said, taking the pen Sarah handed him, and his voice was firm, but inside he was screaming, because this wasn't what he wanted, but what seemed necessary. "This is our shared idea, Sarah. We've discussed it. Emily, do you agree?" Emily nodded, her fingers shaking as she picked up her pen, and she answered, her voice quiet, but with the same determination that had been present in their conversation at breakfast. "Yes, John. It was our idea. We both came to this. I thought I could save us, but I only made it worse. Let's sign and be done with it." They signed the papers, the pens sliding over the papers with a rustle that seemed deafening in the quiet of the office, and Sarah gathered the papers, her smile growing a little warmer, as if she had seen this 1,000 times and knew that the pain would subside with time. But for John and Emily in that moment, it felt like the world had collapsed, and when they left the office, the rain was pouring down, the drops hitting the pavement with such force that it seemed to be trying to wash away their past. They stood under the awning at the entrance, looking at the pouring water, and the last minutes together seemed like an eternity to them, because it was the end, the real end, and John turned to Emily, his voice rough with emotion. "Emily," he said, his eyes meeting hers, tears mingling with raindrops, "is this really the end? Is this really where we've come to this? Whose idea was it to start all this? Mine? Yours? Or did the party ruin it all?" Emily stepped closer, her hand touching his sleeve, and she responded, her voice shaking like leaves in the wind. "It's our fault, John. Both of us. I started by hiding the truth, but you didn't see me before. We got lost in each other. But I love you, even now." And at that moment, in the rain that poured down without ceasing, they embraced a warm, but already farewell embrace, where her head was pressed against his shoulder, and his arms were wrapped around her waist, and in this embrace there was everything. Love, pain, regret, farewell, and when they pulled away, their eyes said what words could no longer, and they went their separate ways, in the rain that washed away their tears, but could not wash away the memories of what had once been their life. The road to the ocean wound through the hills, where the low sun cast long shadows on the pine trees, and John drove in silence without turning on the radio, because any sound, be it music or the announcer's voice, would have seemed like an intrusion into his inner world, which was already full of noise, fragments of memories, words he had not said, and those he had said too harshly. His old sedan, the one he had gotten after the division of his property, hummed at low revs, and this sound was his only companion on the journey to the coast, to the place where he hoped to find at least a shadow of the peace that he had so lacked since he and Emily signed the divorce papers. Los Angeles was left behind, its traffic jams, its hustle and bustle, its offices where Martin was still calling with new demands, and John felt how with every kilometer the city was letting him go, but not the memories that clung to him like wet sand sticking to the skin. He hadn't chosen Santa Barbara by chance. It was their place, his and Emily's. It was where they had spent some of their happiest days, when their marriage was still full of promise, when they could laugh until they cried over something silly, holding hands as the waves lapped at their bare feet. Now, as he drove down Highway 101, the ocean flashing through the trees, those memories came back to him with painful clarity, and he didn't know whether he wanted to push them away or cling to them like a life preserver. He saw Emily in her red dress, running along the beach, her hair blowing in the wind, her laugh louder than the surf. He saw them sitting on the sand, eating fish and chips from a paper bag, and she would smear ketchup on his nose, and he would pretend to be angry, only to kiss her later, the salty taste of the sea on her lips. The memories were so vivid, so alive, he could almost feel the warmth of her hand in his. But then, like a shadow, another image would come: Emily at Leela's party, her smile at Liam, her omissions, her words on the bench that she wanted to spice up their marriage, and that bitterness of betrayal, like acid, would eat away at all the good he was trying to hold on to. John parked at the beach, where the sand was damp from a recent tide and the air smelled of salt and seaweed. He got out of the car, leaving his shoes inside, and walked barefoot toward the water, feeling the cold sand cling to his feet. The waves lapped at the shore with a rhythmic thump that should have been soothing, but instead only served to amplify the noise inside him. He sat down on a large rock, polished by water and time, and stared out at the horizon, where the sky merged with the ocean in a gray-blue haze. Here, away from the city, away from the office, away from the empty house where Emily's note still lay crumpled, he had hoped to find peace, but peace did not come. Instead, his mind swirled in a swirl of the past, where happy days wove with pain like the threads of an old carpet that could never be untangled. Why did everything turn out this way? He thought, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his fingers. He remembered their first meeting in a cafe on Melrose, when Emily spilled coffee on his shirt and was so embarrassed that she offered to pay for the dry cleaning, and he, laughing, told her that it was the best excuse to meet her. He remembered their wedding, small but so warm, where she danced with him to an old Frank Sinatra song, and her eyes sparkled as if the whole world belonged to them. These memories were like a light that he wanted to hold on to. But then that night at Leela's mansion would come and everything would fall apart. He saw her face when she tried to explain why she hid the truth, saw her tears on the bench when she told him she loved him, but he couldn't get rid of the image of her smile at Liam, her ease among those strangers, and that feeling of betrayal sat like a splinter in his heart, not letting him breathe. John tossed a pebble into the water, watching it disappear into the waves, and thought about how they'd come to this divorce. Whose idea had it been? His, when he'd first uttered the word over breakfast, staring into his cold coffee. Or hers, when she'd agreed, her voice shaky but determined. Or was it their shared fault, because they'd both allowed the crack in their marriage to grow until it became a chasm? He knew he hadn't been a perfect husband. His obsession with work, his detachment, his inability to notice Emily trying to get through to him, all of it had played a part. But her decision, her choice to bring him to that party without telling him the truth, had been a blow he couldn't forgive. He'd tried, God knows how he'd tried, but every time he looked at her, he saw not just his Emily, but the woman standing next to Liam, laughing with him as if John were invisible. He remembered their last meeting at the lawyer's in the rain, their parting embrace that had been so warm, so familiar, but already foreign. He could smell her, feel her warmth, and in that moment he almost changed his mind, almost said, "Let's try again." But the words caught in his throat because he knew that trust, once broken, could not be mended, like a broken vase. He loved her so much it was like physical pain, but love could not erase that night, could not return them to the way they had been before. John stood and walked along the shore, the waves lapping at his feet, cold and pitiless like his own thoughts. He remembered how he and Emily had once built a sandcastle here on this very beach, and how she had laughed when a wave had destroyed it, and he had pretended it was a global tragedy. They had been happy then, their world full of light, but now that light was gone, and all that was left was an echo of the past that played in his head like an old melody that could never be forgotten. He wondered if perhaps he could have done more, be more attentive, listened to her, noticed how she was drifting away. But he also knew that her choices, her omissions, her decision to risk their marriage for some game were things he could not accept. The sun was setting, painting the sky crimson and gold, and John stood there, looking out at the water as the last rays of light reflected. He felt lost, like a ship without an anchor, and he didn't know where to go next. He wanted to find peace, he wanted the pain to go away, but instead he found only unanswered questions. Could he forgive Emily? Could he forget? Was their happiness real, or an illusion they had both created to blind them to the cracks? He didn't know, and that not knowing was the hardest thing of all. John sat down on the sand, not caring if his jeans got wet, and closed his eyes, listening to the waves. Emily's words, "I love you," echoed in his head, and he knew she was telling the truth. But the truth couldn't bring back what they had lost. He saw their happy days, their trips, their nights, their dreams, but they were entwined with the bitterness that now defined their story. He wanted to find peace, but instead he found only echoes of the past that would haunt him like a shadow until he learned to live with the pain or found a way to let it go. The rain pounded the windows of their house, her house now, and each drop echoed her own heartbeat, heavy and uneven, as if it were trying to break through the wall of guilt and pain that had surrounded Emily since she and John had signed the divorce papers. She sat on the living room couch, wrapped in an old throw blanket, the same one she and John had bought at an antique store on their first trip together to Mendocino, when they had laughed at its ridiculous pattern of deer and pine trees, but had decided it was perfect for their cozy evenings anyway. Now it was the only thing that kept her warm in a house that had become too big, too empty, too strange without John, without his footsteps on the wood floors, without his habit of leaving his coffee mugs on the table, without his voice, which, even on the hardest days, had been an anchor for her. The living room was dim, lit only by the dim light of a floor lamp that cast long shadows on the walls where the pictures of them still hung: John and Emily on the beach in Santa Barbara, John and Emily at their wedding, John and Emily the day they moved into this house, smiling hopefully. She couldn't bring herself to take them down, even though every time she looked at them it was like a blow, reminding her of what she had lost. Emily clutched the blanket tighter, her fingers digging into the soft material, and she closed her eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they came like waves, inexorable and relentless, carrying her back to that night in Leela's mansion, that evening that had been the point of no return, the moment when their marriage, their love, their lives, had begun to crumble like a sandcastle under the onrush of the tide. She blamed herself so much that the guilt became part of her breathing, part of her every move. She had found the envelope with the invitation to the party. She had, at Kate's urging, decided that this might be a chance to reinvigorate their relationship, which was slowly fading under the weight of routine, John's work, and her own insecurities. She remembered Kate, with her infectious enthusiasm, describing the party to her as an adventure, a way to shake things up, to feel alive. "It's just a game, Emily," Kate had said, sipping wine in her tiny downtown cafe. "Nothing serious, just a chance to see the world in a new way. You see how John is withdrawing into himself? Maybe this is what you need." Emily believed it because she wanted to believe it, because she was desperately looking for a way to bring back the John who had danced with her in the rain, who had looked at her as if she were the center of his universe. But instead, she led him into a trap, into Leela's world, where candles, cocktails, and ambiguous smiles hid something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. "Why didn't I tell him?" she whispered into the void, her voice barely audible, muffled by the rain outside the window. "Why wasn't I honest?" She had asked herself that question 1,000 times, replaying in her mind the night John had found the envelope on the hall table. She had seen his wary look, heard his joke about the sex-swapping thing, and instead of sitting down with him, explaining that it was just Kate's idea, just an attempt to break out of the routine, she had smiled, brushed it off, hidden behind an ease that now felt like betrayal. She had thought she could convince him that he would join in, that he would see it as an adventure, but instead she had lost his trust, lost the look in his eyes that had once told her she was his home. Emily stood up from the couch, her legs shaking as if they were bearing not just her weight, but the weight of all her mistakes. She walked to the kitchen, where the plate still held the remains of the dinner she had cooked the night it had all started. She couldn't bring herself to throw those remains away, as if they were the last evidence of their life together, their last meal when she had still hoped that everything would be okay. She opened the refrigerator, but then closed it again because the empty shelves reminded her that she hadn't been grocery shopping since John had left. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't live in this house, which was now like a museum of their past, full of artifacts she couldn't touch or throw away. Her gaze fell on the note she'd left for John before she'd left for Kate's, crumpled but still lying on the kitchen island. She picked it up, her fingers shaking as she smoothed the paper out, rereading her own words. John, I've gone to Kate's for a few days. I need time. I'm sorry. Emily. The words had been her attempt at self-saving, an attempt to give them both space to figure out what to do next. But now they seemed cowardly, as if she'd run away instead of staying and fighting. She clutched the note in her fist, feeling the tears welling up in her eyes again, and thought about how things might have been different if she'd just talked to him, if she'd not given in to Kate's entreaties, if she'd not let her fear of losing John push her into taking this fateful step. I wanted to save us, she whispered, her voice drowned out by the silence of the house, which was louder than any noise. I wanted you to look at me again. She remembered their conversation on the bench in Leela's garden, his accusations, his pain, his words of betrayal that were like a knife piercing her heart. She tried to explain, tried to say that it wasn't her idea, that she just wanted to bring the spark back into their relationship, but every word she said only drove him deeper into anger, into mistrust, into the abyss that had grown between them overnight. She saw the way he looked at her, not with love, but with pain, and that was the worst of all, because she knew it was her fault. She wanted to scream that she loved him, that she wanted nothing more than their happiness, but the words stuck in her throat, and all she could do was cry, standing in front of him until he walked away into the darkness of the garden, leaving her alone. Emily sat back on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, and stared out the window where the rain made patterns on the glass like tears she could no longer shed. She thought about John, where he was, how he felt. She knew he was going to the ocean. Kate had mentioned seeing his car on the 101, heading for Santa Barbara, and that knowledge was like another blow, because Santa Barbara was their place, their safe haven, their happy place. She imagined him there, barefoot, holding a pebble in his hand, looking out at the waves, and her heart ached at the thought of him searching for the peace she had taken from him. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice so quiet that even the slight creak of the couch drowned it out. She blamed herself for everything, for believing Kate, for not telling John the truth, for letting her fear of losing him push her to take the step that had destroyed their marriage. She remembered their last moments together in the rain outside the lawyer's office, their goodbye hug that had been so warm, so familiar, but already alien. She felt his arms, his warmth, his scent, and in that moment she wanted to tell him that they could try again, that they could make it right. But she saw in his eyes the same pain that was in her heart, and she knew that some cracks were too deep to heal. Now, sitting in the empty house, Emily felt like that night at Leela's had been the point of no return, the moment when their marriage, their love, their life had ceased to be whole. She tried to remember the happy times, their trips, their nights talking until the early hours, their laughter at stupid jokes, but those memories were poisoned by the bitterness that now defined her existence. She blamed herself for not being honest, for giving in to the illusion that one night could change everything, for not fighting harder when John said he needed time. She wanted to call him, to write, to run to the beach with him, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. He was gone, and she was alone in this house that had been theirs but was now hers, and the thought was like a knife she couldn't pull out of her chest. The rain outside grew heavier, and its noise became a symbolic ending to their story. The silence of the house, broken only by the patter of drops, was like the final note in a melody that had once been their love. Emily sat, wrapped in a blanket, and looked into the darkness, where the shadows of the past danced before her eyes, and she knew that this silence, this rain, this emptiness would be her companions until she found a way to forgive herself, or until time erased the pain, leaving only an echo of what had once been their life. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.